The story begins with Meek Mill presenting himself as someone who survived the streets, the system, and repeated attempts to keep him trapped in the same cycle. From early on, his narrative was never just about music, but about survival and respect. He spoke openly about being labeled, targeted, and pushed back toward confinement, even when he tried to change his life. That image mattered because it shaped how fans saw him, not as someone easily manipulated, but as someone hardened by experience. When someone builds a reputation on resilience, people assume they can't be controlled behind closed doors. That belief created a shield around Meek for years, one that made later allegations feel impossible to many supporters. But the narrator points out that the same industry Meek claimed to fight against is also known for testing people quietly, not loudly. And that's where the contrast begins to form. Because while Meek publicly stood as a symbol of growth and independence, his private proximity to powerful figures raised questions, not accusations, questions. Questions about whether survival sometimes comes at a cost that isn't visible at first, and whether respect in the industry always means what it appears to mean on the surface. This foundation is crucial because everything that follows only matters if the audience understands how far Meek had climbed and how much he stood to lose. Things shifted when a lawsuit involving a former collaborator introduced a narrative that no one expected. The case wasn't originally about Meek Mill at all, but as details surfaced, familiar names began to appear in unsettling ways. The narrator explains how claims emerged suggesting that certain gatherings weren't strictly professional, and that influence was exercised through unspoken pressure rather than force. Within those claims, it was alleged that examples of other artists were used as proof that compliance led to opportunity. That's where Meek's name entered the conversation, not as the central figure, but as an alleged example. The impact was immediate. Social media reacted not because the claims were proven, but because they reframed old relationships in a new light. The idea that someone could be aware of inappropriate behavior and still remain silent was more damaging than any single allegation. Silence, in this context, was interpreted as protection. The narrator emphasizes that at this stage, nothing was confirmed, but perception had already shifted. Once a name becomes part of a larger pattern, people stop asking if something happened and start asking how much someone knew. And that distinction would haunt everything Meek said afterward. When Meek finally responded, his reaction became part of the story itself. Instead of a calm dismissal, he came out swinging, attacking the idea, the people spreading it, and the culture questioning him. The narrator notes how his response leaned heavily on identity, where he's from, how he was raised, and what kind of behavior he claims would never be tolerated around him. But to the public, the response felt less like clarity and more like deflection. Rather than addressing the specific claims, he focused on asserting dominance and dismissing the conversation entirely. This approach divided opinion sharply. Supporters saw it as righteous anger. Critics saw it as avoidance. The narrator highlights how online audiences are conditioned to analyze tone as much as words. When someone denies something without directly touching the core issue, people assume there's a reason. Whether fair or not, the damage was done. Instead of shutting the rumors down, the response added fuel. It shifted the conversation from, "Is this real?" to, "Why didn't he just say no?" And once that shift happens, control over the narrative begins to slip away. The situation escalated when an audio recording began circulating, unverified but explosive. The narrator carefully explains that the recording alone proved nothing, yet its existence changed the entire atmosphere. Voices that sounded familiar, context that people filled in themselves. and a former security associate claiming first-hand knowledge of what took place. Whether credible or not, the combination was powerful. Audio doesn't need visuals to be convincing, it only needs to sound plausible. The narrator stresses how quickly people accept something when it aligns with a story they're already questioning. Once listeners believed they recognized voices, confirmation bias took over. The claim that the recording was captured secretly only intensified speculation. It suggested secrecy, risk, and intention. At this point, the narrative wasn't being driven by facts, it was being driven by accumulation. One allegation alone might fade. Multiple overlapping claims begin to feel like a pattern, and patterns are what the internet trusts most. As the public revisited old clips and posts, moments that once seemed harmless were reframed entirely. The narrator describes how older videos resurfaced, now interpreted through suspicion rather than humor. Interactions once dismissed as jokes were now analyzed frame by frame. Even social media activity became part of the evidence pile. Following the wrong account, liking the wrong post, everything was suddenly meaningful. The narrator makes it clear this is how online narratives evolve, not through new proof, but through reinterpretation of the past. Nothing new had actually happened, yet everything felt new. This phase was particularly damaging because it required no statements or witnesses, just memory. And once memory is rewritten, reputation follows. Meek's silence during this stage allowed the speculation to grow unchecked, and by the time he re-entered the conversation, the audience had already made up their minds about what they believed they were seeing. The final layer came from an even more personal claim, one involving a former romantic partner. According to commentary circulating online, the audio may not have come from an employee at all, but from someone once emotionally close to Meek. The narrator emphasizes that this claim remains unverified, but its implications are heavy. If true, it would explain timing, silence, and sudden distance. The suggestion that fear of retaliation kept the recording hidden only added drama. At this point, the story stopped being about one event and became about power. Who has it, who fears it, and who protects whom. The narrator closes by reminding the audience that none of this has been proven in court, but public opinion doesn't wait for verdicts. Once enough pieces feel like they fit, people decide for themselves. The real question left hanging isn't whether something happened, but whether the truth, whatever it is, will ever fully surface.